Back there it says 1:30. Over there it says 1:27. So as given there's another minute. Good afternoon. Welcome. We'll get started here. If you are on Zoom, if you're muted, please stay muted. And if you have any questions, ask them after the chat, after the talk, and put them in the chat, and I will get your questions answered. If you're in the room and you have a cell phone, if you could silence it, that would be greatly appreciated. And this is Dr. Richard McMaster, who's going to talk about the road to independence.
Thank you. When I was in college, and probably when you were too, one of the favorite Blue Book essay topics in the American History Survey was the American Civil War. Was it an irrepressible conflict, or was it the result of a blundering generation? And that might be phrased in different ways, but that was the basic message. And you knew enough to say, well, from 1820 in the compromise over Missouri, right down to the wire on the morning when Abraham Lincoln was to be inaugurated, and the last Republican senator willing to talk about compromise was the rather obscure Senator James Nixon of Connecticut. And he saw he was all alone talking to some Southern Democrats, and it was all over. But that kind of attitude toward the American Civil War probably disappeared from classes that are being taught today, because one of the underlying planks of compromise in the 19th century between the North and the South meant an acceptance in some degree of the continuation of slavery. So that probably is not something that the present generation wants to say, oh yeah, well, slavery was fine. It was a terrible mistake to fight a war over it, and so on. So anyway, I'm borrowing that particular set of parameters to look at the last year as we slide into independence. Was it simply an irrepressible conflict? Was America always predetermined to become an independent nation on its own? Was that something? And some especially local places always want to trace this back practically to the first settler arriving at Jamestown in 1607. That of course we had to break away from the mother country. But then there's the other side, was it a case where opportunities to compromise, opportunities not to offend were thrown away? The the whole reorganization of the empire after 1764 shifted the situation so markedly that it was difficult to see how there wouldn't be conflict with the uh, North American colonies. And sometimes it was a case of what seemed perfectly reasonable and rational to someone in Parliament uh, would be deeply offensive to some people in the colonies. We had, for example, with the Sugar Act in 1764, the perfectly reasonable idea, which was accepted, and there wasn't any great resistance to this part of it, that there should be a high tariff on sugar and molasses and rum imported from French or Spanish colonies because we had all of our own English West Indian colonies that were raising sugar, producing molasses and rum. And shouldn't they be favored? But it was then when we came to the very natural idea of enforcement. How do you prevent wide-scale smuggling? Well, you needed to have a larger customs service, and the customs service had to be dependent on England. You could not rely on just the locals who were probably related to the major smugglers. And so you moved then to the question, could you get a customs officer a fair trial in Massachusetts? Well, maybe you couldn't. So there should be a provision for an admiralty court that could hear that case not in the colony, but somewhere else. And so we could run through a whole list of these things that we talked about over the last 5 weeks, that there were the ways in which what would seem logical to someone in Westminster was deeply offensive to people in the American colonies. Now, could these folks have found a compromise? There were any number of individuals, very prominent individuals, in the Parliament who were arguing continuously for conciliation with America. Edmund Burke, Charles James Fox, Colonel Isaac Barry, who is remembered in the Pennsylvania city of Wilkes-Barre. It's John Wilkes and Isaac Barre were both honored by when that was set up. So there were all these people working there, and there were people on this side who were saying, can't we somehow pull this together? But as we see, by 1774, after 10 years, the distances are getting very, very great. Everything is touched off by the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. The British government had blundered into arranging or passing a tea act that provided essentially for the dumping of East India Company tea on the North American colonies, and that they would not have to pay, the company would not have to pay any tariff or tax, but it would be by a separate act. It would be, it's the last remnant of the Townsend Revenue Act. of 1768, that it would be paid by the American colonists. And so there was great objection to this taxation without representation, and the Sons of Liberty in Boston, who threw the tea into the harbor, were hailed as being the spokesman of all the American colonies, and especially after in May and June 1774, word began to come of what the Americans lumped together as 5 coercive acts, but were intended to punish Massachusetts for its complicity in the destruction of the tea. It's interesting that, just in passing, that, for example, when in Rhode Island in 1772, local people burned the revenue cutter Gaspé. That was a government ship. The reaction in Britain was almost, so what? Whereas private property of the East India Company, you are attacking the very heart of what our whole system is about. Private property should be absolutely sacrosanct. So Parliament got very angry and passed bills that removed Massachusetts from having its own government. It was to be put under a military rule. They closed the port of Boston. There would be no more traffic of any kind, local or otherwise, coming into Boston. And Customs House was moved to Marblehead, which was a very small fishing port north of Boston. And a royal government was continued with the military rule. General Gage is sent to Boston, and so on. And coincidentally, the Quebec Act, which becomes the 5th of these coercive acts, although it wasn't intended so, the Quebec Act, which reorganized the essentially the Canadian territory that had been taken over and lumped into one very, very large province of Quebec, since it was inhabited almost entirely by French-speaking Roman Catholics. The only way to give Quebec anything like a representative government required allowing Roman Catholics to vote. And Catholics could not vote in Britain or in the American colonies. So this was taken as an outrage, but lumped together with the other 5. So at that point, as word comes, they follow very quickly. As word comes in June and July, there is a call for county and colony meetings. The word reached, it came initially to Boston, and they sent riders to take the news to other colonial centers. And when the news reached Williamsburg, the session of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Virginia Assembly, with the council, had just closed. And so the Virginia delegates, most of them, assembled in a tavern in Williamsburg had called for a Virginia uh, convention, and that it would be elected by county conventions. And this was the pattern across the colonies. And they were then calling in these uh, county meetings, sometimes sometimes very democratic ideas, especially when you got to a western county, but especially almost universally, they called, as the Fairfax Resolves did, Fairfax County, Virginia. This is written by George Mason of Gunston Hall, and I was reading it the other day, and I had forgotten how verbose George Mason could get. I mean, you could have said this in about one page, but it went on for pages of resolutions, which were basically that we call for, one, a Continental Congress representing all the colonies, and two, that we will call for a universal and enforceable non-importation to take place and in the end of this year. So the end of December 1774, it's no longer a voluntary non-importation agreement among merchants and so on. No, you will be compelled not to buy any British goods, no matter who you are or where you are. And secondly, or that it, if things have not been resolved, we will go to the even more risky uh, uh, second act, that on September 1st, 1775, we will cut off all export of any kind of goods from the North American colonies to Britain. So it's the county and then ultimately the colony-wide meetings that have already set that pattern before the Continental Congress assembles. Let's look at the next one in September 1774. Hello? Could I have the next? Yeah, thanks. This is the first Continental Congress. It only had a fairly short meeting, but they, as was predicted, presented the Continental Association, that we would now have a non-importation agreement that would be enforced by county committees of safety and correspondence. So in a sense, very early in the meeting of the Continental Congress, you have set up a quasi-government in the American colonies. And yet there were those who were arguing that it's not too late. We could do something different. And John Dickinson of Pennsylvania offered the idea that we have said we can have no taxation without representation. He had argued that himself in the letters of a Pennsylvania farmer, and it was pretty universally accepted in the colonies that only the local colonial assembly, where people were represented by other people that they had voted for to represent them. Bad sentence, but not too bad. So that was widely accepted. But Dickinson here raised the idea that most of the colonies, if not all of them, had a representative actually sitting in Parliament, non-voting colonial agents. so if you had someone sent from Virginia to represent Virginian interests, it was a perfectly reasonable next step to say that that man could be a member of parliament. Let's have a member of parliament from Virginia and a member of parliament from Massachusetts. Now, there would only be a handful of them, and they would inevitably be outvoted, but they would be representing their colonies. And the interesting thing about that is, for the first 120 years or so of the United States, that is really what we had with our Senate. That the senator was not elected by you and me, he was elected by the state of Florida. And he represented Florida. He didn't represent individuals. He didn't have a constituency. And it was only in the early 20th century that we moved to direct election of senators. So that was a very parallel thing. It wasn't an absolutely insane thing, but it was voted down by the majority in Congress. And Joseph Galloway, who was also from Pennsylvania, had another interesting idea that we should have a union of all the colonies, all the continental colonies, and that they should have a common government, but with a royal governor appointed by the king. So he was talking about essentially a united colonies or ultimately a United States, but it would be still under George III. And that was voted down. They did adopt letters to the king and parliament, and again, these were written by John Dickinson. So he was looking for, we can be still members of the British Empire. We can just make little compromises on each side, and that will be all we needed. And those letters were sent, and they were read. They were read by the king, and they were read by Parliament. Let's get the next one here. Oh, we just went black. Yeah, now we fall into a winter of what I call a winter of discontent here. And does it become a glorious spring? General Gage is now effectively the military governor of Massachusetts, established in Boston. He brought in very quickly, and it's interesting because Thomas Gage himself was quite favorable to the colonies. He was not a kind of imperialist, let's stamp out all this rebellion. He was very much in favor of compromise himself, but he felt that he needed to bring in 5 full regiments of the British Army, a force of about 1,300 redcoats. They had been in Boston before, a much smaller group. And if you remember the 1770 Boston Massacre, where Sentry is being stoned and snowballed and calls for help, and a number of other soldiers come out, and then some idiot says, fire, and they automatically fire and killed several people. And so at that point, the troops were moved out of mainland Massachusetts, and they were stationed in Castle William, which is an island out in Boston Harbor. And that they had remained there, so there'd been no no troops on the ground in Boston or elsewhere in Massachusetts. But now Gage is bringing back 5 full regiments of about 1,300 officers and men. And there's inevitable kind of clash with that. So the hostility is growing in the one place that is most hostile to the mother country. And then in February 1775, there's a very interesting incident. The word came out that the Patriots had been managed to smuggle in cannon that they had bought in France or somewhere else, and that they were setting up a kind of artillery park in Salem, Massachusetts. Salem is north of Boston. Not too far. It's about 20 odd miles north of Boston. And Colonel Leslie was sent with a column of British regulars to go to Salem. And somehow or other, Colonel Leslie and the Salem authorities talked to each other. And it developed that this was actually a rumor, but it had no basis in fact. So instead of having a military engagement and soldiers poking in warehouses looking for non-existent cannon, they shook hands and the soldiers marched back to Boston. But then, in April 1775, the word came to Gage that a very large cache of munitions, which had been taken from various government, whatever you call them, storehouses, I can't think of a better word, storehouses for military supplies had all been taken over by the Sons of Liberty, and they did that in a couple of other colonies, and they had just done that in New Hampshire, and then they put them in their hands to be used presumably against the British. So the order was set out to go out to Concord, which is west of Boston, and reclaim those materials. And at that point, Revere and Dawes went riding in the countryside, spreading the word to every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm. And the country folk did that. We now had Minutemen coming with their weapons and so on. And they stood at Lexington, and the two sides exchanged fire, and then the Lexington folk melted away after a few casualties. But when they got to the bridge leading into Concord, there they had a pitched battle, and the British were repulsed. And as they returned overland, going back to Boston, they were attacked by individuals and small groups firing from behind walls and buildings and so on. And they took quite a number of casualties before they got safely to Boston Neck and into the city. Well, let's take the next one. So the Second Continental Congress had was just about to assemble when Lexington and Concord happened. They gathered at the very end of April 1775. So instead of talking about a lot of compromises and non-importation and so on, their first duty was to raise an army. What had happened after Lexington and Concord was that the local militia, really, who had some of them been engaged in the fight. Many of them had simply assembled, were told to come in and occupy the hills overlooking Boston from Dorchester down to Cambridge. And they did. And Massachusetts appointed a general to stand with them. So you had a kind of already a locally imposed siege on the British Army in Boston. But the duty of the Second Continental Congress was immediately to raise an army. So they not only took those Massachusetts people into the service of the Continental Congress, but they created a Continental Army, and with a number of different numbers for each colony to provide. And so they would begin recruiting soldiers in May and June of 1775 in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, in Maryland, everywhere. And on May 10th, after they had created the Continental Army, they appointed George Washington to be the commander of that army. And then the siege of Boston began, which continued until March 17, 1776, when the British Army was withdrawn to Halifax. And that day was a public, because it still is, a public holiday in Boston. And the fact that it was the 17th of March made it an extremely popular holiday in certain parts of the city. So, but at the same time, this is John Dickinson's last hurrah. They drew up the Olive Branch Petition that basically said it's not too late. We can still compromise. We can still stay in the empire. We can still remain under King George III. That was pretty unanimously accepted. And it was sent to England. And in between, the idea that a hill had been occupied by an advance of the British out of the city of Boston led to the first real engagement of the Continental Army at Bunker Hill. And this because the British attacked in classic 18th century style and took very heavy losses, killed and wounded, and were totally defeated, was a blow to anyone who wanted to see compromise, and especially to King George. When George was offered the Olive Branch Petition, he refused to read it. He said, you know, this is, he didn't say it these words, but you know, this is worthless. This is trash sent by rebels. Throw it away. So that was the last attempt at compromise of any kind. And I just have a little denouement on John Dickinson. John Dickinson was a representative from Pennsylvania in the Second Continental Congress. And almost a year later, in the 1st of July, 1776, John Dickinson rose to oppose the resolution that these United States colonies are and have a right to be free and independent states. He believed that they should belong to the British Empire and argued vehemently for that. And then the next day, when they were to vote to accept the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson resigned from Congress. But he did not resign in order to become a loyalist or go to England. He resigned in order to take a colonelcy in the Continental Army and to fight for a free United States of America. So we had, I always find that very interesting that his conviction was we shouldn't be independent, but I'm an American. I'm going to go with my country, and I will fight for it. So at that, I will ask you for your thoughts.
I'm sorry, it's Keith Berg. Do you see any parallel to current events with this kind of thing with, um, I guess I'm seeing some kind of things that haven't happened yet, but might.
Yeah. I mean, we have given our president infinite.
Microphone.
We've given our president infinitely more power than George III ever had. George III could no more have enacted a tariff than he could have flown to Paris for the weekend, and by his own wings, and all sorts of other things. I mean, the British government, by most of the 18th century, the glory of it was that it was this balance of power, that you had the monarch, you had the parliament, and you had the courts and English common law. And it seems like we have jumped over that and said, well, no, we don't need the courts, and the parliament is all, yeah, yes, whatever you say, so. And so I don't know. That's a very partisan statement, but I hope I don't offend anyone, or if I do. So, anybody else?
Yes, typically, how long did it take for communications to get throughout the colonies or between the colonies and in England? In terms of getting word around as to what people were thinking and what people wanted to do?
A pretty good voyage in the 18th century. You were doing amazing time if you crossed the Atlantic in 6 weeks, and often it was more, depending. Now, all of these trading ships carried newspapers, and the American newspapers would clip stuff out of the London Chronicle of this issue and so on, and publish it. So the news could reach a lot of people, but it took a long time, and that's one of the difficulties with a lot of this. That it wasn't like you could know that this had happened today, and 2 weeks later even we know how we should react. That they were often acting on very outdated information and so on, and that's true commercially. That you didn't know in Philadelphia or Baltimore how great a demand for wheat there would be in Spain or Portugal until maybe the harvest is all in, and you have to ship, but you don't know what the prices will be. Did these people have a bumper crop? Did they have a failure, crop failure? That so everybody was sort of walking. We're living in that big gap, time-wise, era. Looks like Rick is about to say something.
Yeah, thanks. Um, You've given us an important understanding, but I know that you have much deeper insights, and I'm wondering if you could do a little bit of a class analysis of those who represented the states, well, the colonies in the First and Second Continental Congress, and who was not represented in terms of interest of America, of people living in the American colonies.
Oh yeah. They vary significantly. Let's start in the South. The representatives in Georgia, pretty much. Georgia maybe a little more mixed, but South Carolina and Virginia, the representatives were all, without exception, wealthy planters, occasionally a wealthy lawyer or such. The poorer people were not represented at all. I think Georgia is a little bit more of a mixed bag. That they had various people. They even had a Methodist in there, which was not necessarily the aristocratic church in the southern states, and Maryland pretty much like that. Interestingly, in the early days of the United States, I think of Maryland. Maryland had a whole tier that you could only run for the assembly if you were worth a certain amount in property. You could only be elected to the upper house if you had a little more property, and you couldn't be elected governor unless you were better off than any of the people below you there. And so it's a kind of attitude that would seem very foreign today, but was very acceptable then. Pennsylvania was full of lawyers, and you know, they're professional people that is now pretty much a middle class representation. One of the representatives from it's from New Jersey, I guess, is John Dickinson. No, that's not his name. John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton, a Presbyterian minister. And so again, it was pretty much and New York somewhat similarly. Now, there was a classic book that came out in the 60s, and then it was a topic that a lot of people wanted to write on, a book called Middle Class Democracy in Massachusetts. And then a friend of mine did Middle Class Democracy in Maryland. You know, was it a myth? And so on. That was his dissertation. But the idea was that most of the New England colonies, because they had a pretty fair representation, that each township elected the people who were in the assembly and so on, you had a much better spread of at least, you know, farmers, solid farmers, and people who had shops or whatnot. It wasn't, so to speak, a quasi-aristocracy. but then obviously, most working class people were not in this crowd at all. They they may have been able to vote for you, but they weren't able to be heard. And women, of course, were represented only to the extent that someone like Abigail Adams could tell her husband what she thought and what he ought to do, and so on. But whether there were no women in, or even listened to in the Continental Congress, and and of course there's a whole slew of other people like the enslaved and free black people who were really not represented in any way. So that's sort of a long-winded response. Anybody else?
You mentioned at one point that the Catholics were not allowed to vote either in England or in the colonies. Was that that um, fact important in determining some of the, perhaps not in the original, or actually in the amendments to the Constitution? Was that particular fact important to generating the amendments related to the freedom to vote for all?
Yeah, it's a slow process. Naturalization required you not only took an oath to the king, this is in the colonies, you not only took an oath of allegiance to the crown, but you also took communion in a Protestant church. So that excluded automatically foreign newcomers who were Catholics or Jews. And that continued in a lot of the state constitutions, that just as there were lots of property limitations, people who didn't measure up to a certain level of property couldn't vote, no matter who they were, what they were. And it took a long time to get the Catholic emancipation, Jewish emancipation. My memory is that the last of those laws that barred either Catholic voting or Jewish voting was repealed in 1836. So we spent, as the United States, we spent 50 years getting rid of that kind of barrier. And I think Maryland was the last one hanging on to one of those. And the same thing that is true in Britain, that because of the history, while, there were very prominent Catholic and Jewish people in the UK, people who had a great deal of money or titles and so on, but they could not legally vote in Ireland or in Great Britain. And it took to 1832 to repeal the bar on Catholic voters in Britain. So that was the objection in 1774 here, that this is a Protestant country. These other people shouldn't be voting. But suddenly you're saying, if they live in Quebec, oh, we love them. We're establishing, they went a further step, that you have established Catholicism as the official religion and so on, which they hadn't, they just made it tolerable and allowed people to worship as they please, which that part of it we had pretty much done up through the 1770s. Here, almost the only exception as far as, while the Church of England was established in certain colonies, and the Congregationalists in most of New England, you paid taxes to the Congregational Church, even if you went to the Methodist or the Baptist or whatever. But it was absolutely, by the time of the American Revolution, you had churches of all denominations functioning in places. John Adams, for example, when he came to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, went to the Jesuit church, St. Joseph's in Philadelphia, and it was everything was accepted. The one exception into the 1770s was because of the way the law worked, that you could register your church or congregation, whatever it was, and your meeting house, and you could have absolute freedom. You could register your clergyman and have absolute freedom. And the Virginia Baptists said, we don't want to go along with anything like that. We want to preach wherever the Spirit leads us, and we don't have a class of clergy. It's whoever the Spirit falls on can preach for us. And so they were ironically locking up Baptists for preaching without a license in Virginia right into the years of the American Revolution. The Methodists troubled them also, but in a different way, because they had no problem with allowing a free black or even a slave to be a local preacher. And so, and in 1785, there was a big drive by the Methodists in Virginia to abolish slavery. And interestingly, all the big wigs, Washington, Mason, Jefferson, everybody said, oh, yeah, the slavery, terrible thing. We agree with you, brother. But nobody voted for it, and it lost, and that was the end of that drive. But it's just interesting how there's a whole kind of religious side to the whole period here that's very interesting. Well, I'm sort of droning off here, so thank you all.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it.
Oh, by the way, we pick up at this point in fall term with a course that is labeled Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. So in other words, if you like this, you can get more of the same. And if you didn't like it, don't bother to register.